His daughter vanished 24 years ago, then he got the call. For some, hope is a tiny, fragile light in an overwhelming darkness. But for Rick Lafferty, hope wasn't a flicker, it was an anchor. A heavy, stubborn weight he carried for 24 years. That's 8,690 days. For all that time, every ring of the phone, every knock at the door, sent a jolt of that same agonizing mix of hope and fear through him. Hope that he would finally get an answer, and the paralyzing fear of what that answer might be. His 10-year-old daughter, Natasha, who everyone called Alex, was gone. She and her mother, Susan Carter, had vanished from Beckley, West Virginia, back in the summer of 2000. It was like they just dissolved into thin air, leaving behind a silence that would stretch for more than 2 decades. The police had no real leads. The trail went ice cold. But a father's hope, as stubborn as the Appalachian Mountains around him, refused to die. Then, one ordinary day in April of 2024, the phone rang. This call was different. It wasn't another false lead or a well-meaning psychic. This was the call that would finally end the 24-year-long question. And the answer came from a source that no one ever expected, carrying a secret that was buried for decades, unearthed by a killer's dying breath. Section 1. The Disappearance. Before the silence, there was life. Before she was a face on a missing person poster, Natasha Alex Carter was a bright, lively 10-year-old girl. To get the depth of this loss, you have to understand what was lost. Friends and family remember Alex as a typical kid, full of energy, a girl on the very edge of her own life with a future that seemed as wide as the West Virginia sky. She had pets she loved, friends she laughed with, and a father who adored her. That father was Rick Lafferty. By 2000, his relationship with Alex's mother, 41-year-old Susan Carter, was over, and it wasn't a friendly split. The FBI would later call the custody battle over Alex contentious. It was a painful, messy situation with a child caught in the middle. Susan had even told Rick during a mediation meeting that he would never see his daughter again. Soon after, she was a no-show at the next custody hearing. Rick was granted full custody, but it was too late. Susan and Alex were gone. The last time anyone can say they for sure saw them was August 8, 2000. At the time, Susan and Alex were staying at the Beckley home of a man named Larry Webb. To the outside world, he was just a friend, an older man in his late 50s offering a place to stay for a mother and daughter going through a tough time. But his house on Kyle Lane would become the last place they were ever seen alive. When it became clear they were truly missing, the initial investigation was clouded with confusion. The most obvious theory, given the nasty custody dispute, was that Susan had made good on her threat. Had she just taken her daughter and started a new life somewhere far away from Rick Lafferty? A felony warrant for kidnapping was issued for Susan on November 13, 2000. It was a logical conclusion. It's a narrative that's a lot easier to swallow than the darker alternatives. A mother running away with her child is a family drama. A mother and child vanishing at the hands of someone else is a horror story. Rick Lafferty, however, felt a deep, gnawing dread. He knew his daughter. He was certain Alex would have found a way to call him or her grandmother. The complete and total silence just felt wrong. He told the Wyoming County Sheriff's Department about his fears, but it felt like his pleas were falling on deaf ears. He was the ex-husband in a custody battle, a figure investigators might have just dismissed as overly emotional. He later said his initial fears were pretty much ignored. This official theory of parental kidnapping meant that for years, the case was focused on finding a fugitive, not a victim. But inside the house they left behind, there were unsettling clues. One, in particular, was sinister, though nobody would grasp its full meaning for more than 20 years. At some point, someone had fired a gun in the bedroom that 10-year-old Alex was using. Years later, a single bullet would be found lodged in the wall. But at the time, the initial investigation turned up nothing. No signs of a struggle, no witnesses, no ransom note. Just 2 people gone. And so, the days turned into weeks. The weeks bled into months, and the months stretched into the first agonizing year. The case file grew heavy with dust. For the rest of the world, life moved on. But for Rick Lafferty, time was frozen on August 8, 2000. He was trapped in a nightmare, where his daughter was forever 10 years old, and the question of what happened to her was a constant, tormenting presence. The long wait had begun. Section 2. The long wait. 24 years. That's a lifetime. It's long enough for a child to grow up, go to college, get married, and have kids of their own. For Rick Lafferty, those 24 years were a desert of not knowing, marked by agonizing milestones. Every birthday Alex missed, every Christmas with an empty chair, each one was a fresh wound. While the official case went cold, Rick's search never did. He became his own detective. He put up missing person posters, his daughter's smiling 10-year-old face slowly fading in the sun and rain. He talked to anyone who would listen, reporters, P.I.S., strangers on the street. He became a familiar, haunting figure in his community, a man defined by a single, desperate question: "Where's my daughter?" He would later say he never gave up hope, but admitted there were dark and lonely times. How could there not be? It's a special kind of torment called ambiguous loss, a state of grief with no closure. Is your loved one alive and suffering? Are they gone forever? The mind cycles through every possibility, each one more painful than the last. Rick lived in that purgatory for over 2 decades. He described it as a constant state of melancholy, a deep sadness, but with a sliver of hope he refused to let go of. He drew strength from other cases that ended in miraculous reunions. When Elizabeth Smart was found alive in 2003, it renewed his faith. He thought, "That gave me hope that things do happen. That gave me hope and renewed my faith in the system." It was those glimmers of light that fueled him through the years of silence. He kept writing letters and making calls, pestering the authorities, refusing to let his daughter's case become just another forgotten file in a dusty cabinet. He knew that if he stopped fighting, everyone else would, too. Meanwhile, the man who held the answer to all of it, Larry Webb, was living his life just a town away, hiding in plain sight. For years, he was just a name in a cold case file, the owner of the house where Susan and Alex were last seen. The parental abduction theory had shielded him from any real scrutiny. When local news outlets questioned him during a later search of his property, he played the part of a confused old man. "I don't remember," he said, claiming he had dementia. "I can't say exactly." But new energy from investigators eventually brought them back to him. In 2021, the FBI announced a renewed push for answers. Fresh eyes re-examined the original files, and the focus finally shifted toward the darker possibility of foul play. And if there was foul play, the last person to see them alive, Larry Webb, was the most logical suspect. In 2022 and 2023, law enforcement, including the FBI, executed search warrants at Webb's home. This time, they weren't just looking around. They were looking for evidence of a violent crime. They tore into the walls of the bedroom Alex had once used, and they found it. Buried inside the wall was a bullet. It was physical proof that a gun had been fired in that room. The bullet was sent to the FBI lab for analysis, and the results were the breakthrough the case had desperately needed. It was forensically linked to the murder of Alex Carter. In October 2023, armed with this undeniable link, the state indicted Larry Webb, now in his 80s, for the first-degree murder of 10-year-old Alex Carter. After 23 years, the shadow on the edge of the case now had a name and a face. He was arrested, but Webb was old and in failing health. For Rick Lafferty, it must have been another form of torture. The man who held the answers was finally in custody, but his body was failing, and he threatened to take his secrets to the grave. The clock was ticking. Rick's story is a powerful testament to a father's resilience in the face of unimaginable pain. The drive for answers is a powerful human instinct. If you believe these stories of long-awaited justice need to be told, consider subscribing so you don't miss another one. Section 3. The Confession. For a man who had waited 24 years for a phone call, the one that finally came in April 2024 was almost too surreal to believe. Rick Lafferty was just going about his life when he got the news from law enforcement. Larry Webb, the man charged with his daughter's murder, was dying, and he was finally talking. In the first week of April, investigators visited Webb at his nursing home. Faced with the evidence and his own mortality, something inside the 82-year-old killer finally broke. He began to confess, and it wasn't a reluctant, piecemeal admission. The Raleigh County prosecuting attorney, Ben Hatfield, would later call it a detailed, undeniable, unconflicted confession. Imagine that scene. A killer, his body giving out, unburdening himself of a secret he'd carried for a quarter of a century. Why now? Was it a flicker of conscience? A last-ditch effort to clear his soul? Or was it just a final, desperate act of control? We'll never know for sure, but the confession itself laid out the horrific truth. Webb told them it all started with an argument over money. He claimed some cash he had in the house went missing, and he suspected Susan Carter had taken it. An argument exploded, and in that moment of rage, Larry Webb shot and killed 41-year-old Susan. In the aftermath, Webb told investigators he knew he had ruined his life forever. A moment of panic, of pure evil, took over. There was a witness, a 10-year-old girl who had just seen her mother murdered. And so, Webb made a second, even more chilling decision. To avoid being caught for the first murder, he had to kill Alex Carter. He went into her room and shot the 10-year-old child. He described how he wrapped both of their bodies in bed linens. For 2 days, their remains lay on the cold concrete floor of his basement. Meanwhile, he went into his backyard and dug a shallow grave in the woods on his property. Then, he buried them together. This was the story. The horrible, brutal, and heartbreaking truth. It was never a parental abduction. Alex hadn't run away. She and her mother were murdered over a dispute about cash, and a little girl's life was snuffed out simply because she was a witness. The confession was a bombshell, but it was still just words. Police needed to find the bodies. Webb was even brought to the site, but was too frail and confused to pinpoint the exact spot. For 3 days, a local landscaping crew helped investigators, digging up the backyard with excavators, row by row. Then, on Monday, April 22, 2024, a strange, poetic twist of fate. Larry Webb, the man who held the secret, suffered a final medical episode in the hospital. At around 10:30 in the morning, he was pronounced dead. Just 6 hours later, back at his property, the search team found them. Buried in the shallow grave Webb had described, they unearthed human remains. Beckley Police Deputy Chief Dave Allard said, "It was later that same afternoon when we found Susan and Alex Carter." The prosecutor could only describe the timing as a bit of a poetic ending that not even I could write. The killer died on the exact same day his victims were finally recovered. Section 4. The Aftermath. The discovery in Larry Webb's backyard sent a shockwave through the community, and most of all, through the life of Rick Lafferty. The long, agonizing wait was over. The truth, in all its horror, was finally out. Formal identification would follow, but for all intents and purposes, the search for Susan and Alex Carter was over. They had been found. For Rick, the news brought a tsunami of conflicting emotions. At a press conference the next day, he said, "It's kind of a sad day, but also a happy day because I can finally bring my baby home." His voice thick with 24 years of grief. It's the definition of bittersweet. The tiny hope that she might be found alive was now gone. The finality of her death was a fresh, sharp pain. But the not knowing was over. He knew what happened. He knew where she was. And he could finally give her a proper burial. At that same press conference, Rick Lafferty held up a small object for the cameras. It was a hairpin, found with Alex's remains. A simple, everyday object a 10-year-old girl might have worn. It was a tangible link to his daughter, a heartbreaking artifact from a life cut short, a final memento from the little girl he had lost twice. Once to the unknown, and now, again, to the terrible truth. While the what and where were answered, the why still defies comprehension. Webb killed Susan over a dispute about money, but he murdered Alex out of cold, selfish calculation to cover his tracks. He knew he had ruined his life forever, and in that moment, he decided an innocent child's life was the price of his secret. With Webb gone, there would be no trial, no cross-examination, no deeper dive into the mind of a man who could live with himself for 24 years. The full explanation of his darkness was buried with him. The case also raised hard questions about the initial investigation. Rick had always said his early fears were dismissed. When asked about it, one official acknowledged, "Some mistakes, I think, were made up front that we're looking into currently." It's a painful what if. If his fears had been taken more seriously from day one, could the truth have been found sooner? But for Rick Lafferty, the focus was on honoring his daughter. And he had a message for other families trapped in that same limbo he endured for so long. "For others in my situation, I just want to tell them to never give up hope," he said. Never give up, because someone is going to listen. Eventually, someone will listen. The case of Natasha Alex Carter is a story about the profound darkness of a single, evil act and a secret kept for 24 years by a man hiding in plain sight. It's a story about the failures and eventual successes of the justice system and the power of forensics to give a voice to victims long after they've been silenced. But more than anything, this is a story about a father's love. It's about Rick Lafferty's refusal to let the world forget his daughter. For 8,690 days, he carried the torch of hope through a darkness that would have consumed most people. He fought against silence, against bureaucracy, and against time itself, all for the chance to one day have an answer, no matter how painful. The resolution wasn't a happy ending. There's no happiness in discovering your child was murdered, but it was an ending. It brought the kind of peace that only certainty can provide. It transformed Alex from a missing person back into a memory, a daughter who could finally, at long last, be brought home. Rick Lafferty's journey is a powerful, heartbreaking reminder that for the families left behind, a case is never truly cold, and that hope can be the most resilient force of all.